Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna briefly talk about electronic voting first, because it's the place where this second factor correctness started, the application in which you want for sure the device not to be cheating on you. It was firstly on electronic voting. So I'm gonna first introduce a little bit about electronic voting, then talking about voting when the device is not trusted. After that, I want to talk about the security details that makes this field, the electronic voting field, so controversial. And I'm going to introduce the second factor correctness as the topic I want to talk about, and how to use it on other applications. In this case, I'm going to talk about internet banking, because I think it's another place where you don't want your device to cheat on you. So let's start with a brief introduction to electronic voting. Let's say that electronic voting can be viewed as just an application in which you use computers in order to solve some electoral process. This started from the self-printed ballots, in which basically you avoid the cost of printing everything. And then someone introduced these machines to have a validation of the results. So instead of having people reading the results, you have your machine, so you know for sure that it's going to be no mistakes on the counting. After that, they got the automated tally, which was basically doing the same, but configuring the ballots in a way that you can count them later. The next step was, why don't we allow the voters to directly vote from a device? This didn't work out as good as they were expecting, because voting devices ended up being possibly, well, flawed. So people was able to modify some votes on other people, even on a huge area of a city. And that was the reason which motivated the idea of remote electronic voting. So instead of giving a machine that everyone can break, just try to spread it so people can vote from their devices. And then you still need to know how to do that in a way that you admit that these devices are not going to be trusted. So the most important things about electronic voting is these three security requirements. The first one is integrity. Everyone might understand why. So we want to have the right results from an election. The second one is privacy. Again, everybody understands. No one wants to know what other people voted, or better in the other way, you don't want other people to know what you vote. But for electronic voting, mainly for this case, when you have all the information spread, it is one of the most important topics to have verifiability. So after the election, everyone can validate that the whole process was conducted in a way that guarantees the final result is the correct result. These security requirements are used also in classical elections. So there is no other way. In classical elections, you want to have privacy, you want to have correctness, and then there are these auditing processes with physical ballots in which you basically are providing the same properties. Privacy and verifiability will remain the same with ballot printing, as we mentioned before. But when you move into an environment where you don't have all this control, then you have to challenge a little bit these concepts and try to find a step in the middle from what is privacy. Because, of course, if everyone knows the other devices, you might need to agree on an achievement on privacy. It's not about everything is going to be private, for sure not. I mean, you are using a device, and if someone has access to it, it should know what you have voted. But the important thing is that this attacker cannot make public your choosing and guarantee to the rest of people that this is the right election. So the case with the more controlled environment was when they introduced these voting machines. But unfortunately, if you Google for Brazilian or US voting machines, you will see there were some issues lately, and that was affecting the whole image or perception on electronic voting. So to summarize it a little bit, let's see which are the main challenges when you face these properties in an election. First of all, we have privacy versus integrity. The main problem here is that you want to know that everyone has voted, or at least that only people in the electoral roll has voted. But you also want to provide anonymity. So how can you achieve both properties at the same time? This is one of the challenges. The other one is privacy against verifiability. Usually when you have verifiability, you need to prove that all the protocol has been done properly. But in this process, you need to at least achieve a level of privacy, so any voter might know for sure that his vote is private. The other step is security against performance. This is a classical one in cryptography world, so you have to use lots of cryptographic primitives. This may affect the performance, so it's a very old friend. And then we have integrity versus usability. When you are trying to do an electronic voting, you know that your final user might not be very, let's say, accomplished in the field of cybersecurity. So you need to make things easy enough for them to allow them for voting. Otherwise, would be just a way to prevent them from voting. But in the same way, you need to ensure that they are secured. So how do we do that? First of all, let's see which are the main phases of an election. This is an electronic voting made like the standard of it, okay? So there are many details on different elections, but the main standard is this one. First, we have a setup phase where you know the candidates and you have the electoral rolls. You might set up the public infrastructure and everything. Then you have the voting phase. In this phase, the voter basically chooses the candidate, and then he needs to encrypt, to compute zero knowledge, to add some several information, and then digitally sign the ballot and send it to the server. This step is a very complicated step from the point of view of a voter, so you need to find something to make it easier. Once everyone has voted, we have the tallying phase, in which basically the server gathers all the encrypted votes, and it needs to face a process of anonymization, which usually is done by means of mixing of the ballots when you work with traditional elections. But the same concept exists also with cryptography. So that's the thing that we do. And then with these mixed ballots, the next step is to find a place, not necessarily a place with internet access. So an offline place, it would be even better, where you can just plug the keys from several parties and decrypt the whole ballots. Once all of that is done, during the process, the server, the voting device, and everything has been computing zero-knowledge proofs, which help on showing that all the process has been run properly. The last step is when you allow everyone to do a verification of that the process is okay, the people who voted is in the electoral roll, the election results have not been modified. So which are these proofs? Let's talk first about the whole process to understand where are these proofs applied, okay? First, when we have the phasing of privacy versus integrity, we know that digital signatures may allow us to identify each voter. So if we have a properly set up public infrastructure, this should be rather easy to do. Then you know that we want the votes to be secret, so why don't use the normal stuff? Just encrypt them. So people who is checking the information is not going to be able to retrieve any. But then we have the last step. And the last step is how do you anonymize if you need an encryption and a signature on that encryption. You need to find a way to be able to split the signature from the ciphertext. Otherwise, even if you encrypt your vote, at some point this vote will be decrypted. So if I have a decryption and a proper signature, it is very easy to relate which is the voting option from each of the voters. There are two ways to do that, and both of the ways rely on a cryptographic concept, which is homomorphic operation. Let's first talk about which are the spaces, and then I'm going to try to show where this operation applies. So mixing is a very similar process. You just have a set of ciphertexts. You just permute them, so you basically mix them. But if you only do that, you still have the same relation. So you just have the same structure, but with different entries, which can be sorted out again. For this reason, we need to re-encrypt all the values. Many crypto systems don't allow re-encryption, but with a homomorphic operation, what we can do is from one valid ciphertext encrypting a message, we can obtain another valid ciphertext encrypting exactly the same message. This is very useful in this case because it allows to generate a new set of ciphertexts which have no relation with the original ones, and with the permutation applied previously, you know that no one can relate them as long as you have the permutation applied secret. So usually, because of the importance of this step, this permutation and re-encryption is done by several parties. So even though we have some colliding parties, if at least one of them is behaving properly, you know for sure that the votes are anonymized. However, when we are doing this, there is the problem of how can you prove that all this information has been properly encrypted? Or pointing out in the other way, how do you know the new set of ciphertexts are not completely randomly generated ciphertexts for voting another person? There is no way you can distinguish a ciphertext for one vote and a ciphertext for another. So if one of these parties was going to cheat, it will basically succeed unless you force it to prove in zero knowledge that they have applied a proper permutation. The other alternative, which is a little bit easier to understand, it's called homomorphic tallying. As I mentioned before, the homomorphic operation allows us to, from one ciphertext, obtain another one with the same clear text. This is basically because the homomorphic operation, what it really allows is to operate two ciphertexts in a way that the plain text, the value that we wanted to encrypt, is operated. So basically, to do what we wanted to do before, we will just operate like a ciphertext and the unity ciphertext. So this multiplication would say like 3 times 1, so it's 3. You have the same ciphertext. With the homomorphic tallying, we have a different approach in which what you do is you have all of them and you operate them. So let's suppose that you vote for prime numbers. So I vote for number 3 and another colleague votes for number 5. The addition or the homomorphic operation of these two ciphertexts will result on a new ciphertext encrypting 15. Obviously, from the value 15, you can always retrieve the primes, but you will never know if I contributed to this new number with the prime 3 or with the prime 5. This idea applies to the homomorphic tallying in the sense that all the votes are homomorphically operated, and then when you decrypt them, you just have a number that you can factorize because you know the primes, and then obtain the result without knowing who applied each prime number to the addition. So, I have mentioned that we required a zero-knowledge proof for proving that the permutation has done properly. It is important to know what is a zero-knowledge proof. As we don't have many time to introduce this topic, and mostly, I guess most people will not be interested, a zero-knowledge proof is basically a protocol where you guarantee that a statement is true. So, for instance, in the mixing, what you want to guarantee is that the new ciphertext, the new set of encrypted votes, is obtained from the original set of encrypted votes by applying a permutation. Why is it called zero knowledge? It's called zero knowledge because basically you don't leak information about the statement itself, the secret that makes the statement true, but only about the fact that it's true. To show a small example that you can find in Wikipedia, but it's very helpful for the case, you can see that imagine that you have Alice and Bob. So Alice wants to prove to Bob that she knows a path inside the cave that connects A to B, but she doesn't want to show Bob which is this path. She just wants Bob to know that this path exists without showing the path. So what she would do is she would get inside the cave, no matter from which side, and she will ask Bob to ask for going out on one of the two sides. The only way that she can go if she was entering from B and getting out from A is if it is a path inside, right? So basically, if she ends up going out of the cave from the other side, you can assume that for sure it must be a path, otherwise it will be impossible to do it. With the zero knowledge proof, what you do is the same idea. So you have one vote, you have some proofs, and then you have another value, like the set of encrypted ballots, and then you prove that some permutation has been applied correctly, even though you don't know which is this permutation. Okay? It's a very high-level concept, but I think for the case of the presentation, it's just important to know it's feasible. So why do we use these zero-knowledge proofs in electronic voting? So mainly, during the decryption, you need to prove that the results of the election come from decrypting with the proper secret key. Otherwise, you can always decrypt different values if you are not using the secret key that is associated with the public key of the election. So this thing needs to be proved. The secret parameter on this proof is the secret key, of course. During the encryption, sometimes you also need to prove that the thing that you encrypt is a proper candidate. This proof just needs to prove that you have done that, but without leaking the candidate, of course. So this also exists. And in the mixing, as I explained, the only thing is that there is the permutation masking values, and then you just prove them right with this secret. From the security versus performance, I mean, there is you have to use public key crypto systems, you have to use zero knowledge proof, you have to set up your PKI to be able to sign properly. So the only thing that you can do is the widely known solution that we have in real world. Except that there is no solution, you just need to do the best you have. And fortunately for us, nowadays, the devices are, let's say, fast enough or performant enough to allow that to happen. Then we have another problem, which is integrity versus usability. This is a problem because you need to use cryptography. We need to use zero knowledge proof. It's a very hard concept, and we cannot ask the voters to know about it, right? No voter will vote if it requires knowledge about crypto systems, identification protocols, public infrastructure. So what we need to do is find some sort of way in which these operations are totally transparent for the voter, in a way that the voter feels like voting is like, I don't know, like ordering a pizza. Like you are choosing just one thing from a list, and this is your vote, and instead of being like a pizza, in this case, it should be a properly secure communication. Well, how do we do that? Basically, we just delegate all these operations on the voting device, and you just ask the voter to choose one thing, and the voter device will do all the crypto, will receive all the information, and will basically solve all these issues with the hardness of the computations. However, we were talking about integrity, and if we rely only on crypto devices, on devices to compute cryptography, then we also need to trust in too many things. As we have shown in the previous talks, there are many ways to, let's say, gain control over a device. It doesn't matter if it's a laptop or a mobile device. There are ways to gain control of it and to be able to manipulate the elections. So in this case, you need to know that the binaries have not been modified, but is that enough? In fact, what you need to know is that the application is behaving properly. So you know that even if an attacker is there, he cannot modify the proper activity of the application. But even if the activity is properly done, still you are on a voting device, so you need to know that this device doesn't have hardware vulnerabilities, backdoors that allow to infiltrate other operations. Mainly, this assumption in a real world, it is completely unfeasible. So the only solution is just assume that you cannot trust any device. Assume the voter is going to vote from something that will gather all the information, and try to make the election still in this environment secure, or at least that preserves integrity, so he knows the vote has not been changed. This is mainly the reason that motivates the talk about voting with no confidence. So we want to provide a countermeasure, which is basically a countermeasure against a device that is already broken. So even if you are able to break everything, you have no idea, well, you have no way to obtain information about it. So previously we were talking about verifiability, and this is mostly what we want to do. We want to verify that the vote that we want to vote is the vote that is sent over our device. So in an election, there are 3 steps of verifiability. One is this step from the voting device, from the voter through the output of the voting device. Then we have the second part, which is called recorded as cast, which means if this information is, let's say, modified during the communication, can we detect that? Can we prevent that from happening? Can we ensure that this didn't happen? So yeah, this is another kind of verification. I would say it's maybe the easiest one to achieve. And the final one is the counted as recorded property, which basically takes care of the fact that the things that you count are exactly the votes that you received. So it's very straightforward. In our case, I'm going to talk mostly about the cast as intended property, because it's the case where your device is broken. Well, not broken, sorry. Say attacked or completely misbehaving. There are 2 ways of achieve this cast as intended verifiability. The 2 approaches are very similar, very different. One of those is to challenge the system. So I know that my device might be misbehaving. So as the voter, I ask my device to generate a ballot for a candidate. And once the ballot is generated, instead of sending it, I want my device to prove to me that this vote has been properly computed. So I ask first to receive the vote, and then with the computed vote, I need a second device which validates that this vote contains the message for the right candidate. The problem with that is that if you send this vote, you are basically leaking a lot of information, because your first device knows what you voted, your second device knows what you voted. So it's a very risky approach. Usually what is done is to ask the device to prove that it has been, that it's computing the vote properly a random amount of times. So if you ask like 5 times and then the 6th time the 6th time you send it, then it's the harder approach for your attacking device to cheat on you, because the device doesn't know which one is the one that you are going to send and which one is the one that you are going to analyze. However, the vote that you send would never be the one that you have studied. So by challenging the system, you are not proving that your vote contains the right option. You are just challenging your device to prove that it's a trusted device. The other approach goes for the message validation. Basically, in this case, what you do is that you ask your voting device to generate the ballot, and then you ask the voting device to compute a zero-knowledge proof, which basically stands for the candidate, but keeps the candidate secret. With these 2 information, you can send the ballot and the zero-knowledge proof to the server, and from the zero-knowledge proof, the server is able to compute a code. The code is unique for its candidate of the election. And in this way, once the voter receives the code, he knows that he voted for the right option, because previously he should have a paper with all the candidates and their corresponding vote. There is no way for the attacker to learn the codes, because the code is a derivation of the secrets from the voter. So even if he wants to guess, he still needs the keys the keys from the server, so it cannot forge this message. The 2 approaches are very different, and here it is basically it's like the flow of operations in those cases. In the first case, you have like 3 operations. First you generate it, then you check the ballot correctness, and you repeat this operation until you are confident on your device, and then you send the vote. So the most interesting advantage of it is that the cheating device do not know if it's being challenged or not. So people who just basically ask for the vote and send it have a, let's say, 50% chance of succeeding, because it's from the attacker perspective, the device would at least work properly once, because otherwise at the first test it would fail. The validation of this result is always sound. So if I got a proper ballot, I know for sure it contains the valid candidate. And of course, the voter is able to generate trust on the device. So if he doesn't trust the device, he will just not vote from it, and that would be the safest option for him. So that's very good. The problem on the other side is that the cheating probability rely basically on the fact that you are, let's say, challenging it. So if you challenge it 2 times, the attacker probability to succeed is 50%. If you challenge it twice, then it's 2 to the 2. So it's 0.25, so 25% chances. And this grows every time you challenge it. But it requires a second device to be able to know that the first device computed the vote correctly. So the most problematic approach here is that we mentioned before, we need to have our voters having usability, right? But how do you ask the voter to challenge the device and then vote? At the end, they do not care. So an attacker would just forward the bad message, and if he got caught, we'll just accept that you cannot succeed with all the voters. We will have success with most of them. So this is enough to cheat on an election. This opens the space for plenty of social engineering attacks in which you fake that your vote is correct, and then the voter might think that it's correct. So at the end, this is very controversial. The other option was the one in which the voter has his paper and sends the ballot, receives a code, and then validates the code. So it's not only receiving the code, because otherwise it could cheat. It would send information from the device to the server, but once the information is there, it just don't retrieve any code, and the voter cannot do anything. So in order to validate that this was the right vote, the voter needs to actively input a validation code, which also enables him to validate the code, because as we mentioned before, voters are not very eager to collaborate on the security. So you need to find a protocol that involves them in an active way. Which are the advantages? It is very easy to validate a code of 4 or 5 digits from a voter. It's from the voter's perspective, it's very good. The thing is that there are some ways that allow this process to be validated by external auditors in zero knowledge again, so no one knows anything, but at least they help on validating it. But it makes the election or the voting process more costly, so it has not been implemented yet in real-world elections. The whole process encourages the voter participation because he needs to participate actively, otherwise the vote is not sent. The proof applies to the ballot. So the ballot sent is the one that contains the right option. It's not like in the past where you just gain trust on the device. In this case, you know for sure that the message is right. And it only requires one voting device unless you count the paper, because you need a paper. You could have also a second device which has all the list, but with a paper is enough. So that's very good for from the voter's perspective. The probability of cheating here has increased because in the previous case, you opened the ballot, so no one could cheat. It's 100% chances of knowing if that is correct or not. In this case, you rely on a very negligent probability, but it's worth mentioning. Then the entire proof can only be validated by the voter, which basically means that even if you do the proof, the only one who can proceed with it is the voter. And again, we have the same problem. They do not care. They don't want to do it. So we need to find an approach that is also more active. The thing is that how do we face this problem in electronic voting? It's mostly conditioned by the fact that all the security requirements are very restrictive. So we have these 3 security requirements, And we know that we cannot fail, because failing in an election, it means changing the way a city, a government, a country, even global stuff like Europe, something like that, rules or takes the next decisions. So the question that we were thinking with my colleagues was: are there other transactions where correctness is very important, but there are not all these so hard to meet requirements? And fortunately for us, we found that yes, they are. Let's see which are other cases in which we need a validation of our details. We found that mostly nowadays there is a big effort on fixing authentication problems. Impersonating seems to be something very common and very easy to do. And for this reason, people is thinking on many solutions on that field. So why is that? Why is the authentication so important? Well, basically it's because it's the first security measure. So if you want to do something and you force people to authenticate, you know for sure the guy who is attacking you needs to proceed with the authentication step. All of the attackers will need to authenticate at some point. This is the main advantage. Unfortunately, as we mentioned before, it also faces this security against usability problem. And when you deal with authentication processes, you also used to deal with short passwords and recovery methods. So when someone forgets about the password, he has another way to find it. And historically, due to these reasons, these approaches have been broken, either because the companies are using bad practices in the way of storing the passwords, or because the users are just using very, very easy to guess passwords, so the attacker just need to do a very small educated guess. So what do we have? We have second factor authentication. So someone comes here and says, yeah, instead of making these hard passwords or all these approaches, let's find a different solution in which I ask someone to authenticate and I retrieve some information on another device. We know that from Google. We know that even from video games. There are video games that offer you like keys to be able to enter the game on the login phase. So why do they do that? They do that because it will prevent unauthorized accesses, and by this it means that you cannot access when the user is not there. So if the user is not close to the second device to validate it, you know for sure that he's not going to use it. There is no way you can manipulate that from him. It is very easy to use. The user just needs to click on a second device. That's the perfect approach. I mean, it's still harder than writing the password, but it's very easy to do. And it offers also some sort of a physical protection, because you have a second device. So even if someone tries to attack your computer, you have another hardware that might be attacked to in order to provide the authentication from both sides. The problem here is that if your device from which you are authenticated is corrupted, then it will not try to attack your authentication. It will just let you proceed with it. And once you are authenticated, it will attack you, because it will be very easy for him to impersonate you. So, why is that a problem? Why do we put so much effort on this authentication? It's basically because we don't want people to impersonate. But does second factor authentication prevent that from happening? I mean, if I am not willing to authenticate myself, it surely does, right? So if I'm not using the application, no one else can log in without the second factor. But what happens if I am already there? If I want to, like, what's one of the examples? Like messaging. Imagine that you are accessing your email. You used to be logged in your email. So if I have access to your computer, I will be able to impersonate you. No matter how hard it is your authentication method, you are already opening this gate for me to attack. So what do we have then? We have that you need to find a way to not only prevent authentication, but to prevent operations inside from happening. So we have seen that there are different approaches that achieve this solution, but most of them are based on trying to send you information without telling you everything. So the information is very vague. You just received a code that says someone tried to do a transaction. For instance, in Google, for instance, someone tries to log in from some device, but most of the users will not be able to see if this is a threat or not. They might think that if this is the case, I might be accepting because I wanted to access. So maybe there is a problem. It's very easy to do social engineering. And also, if I have access to the device in which you are looking this error, I can always forge the message. So you will not even realize that I'm doing something. The second case, it's when the message that you receive, it's way more precise. So basically it is telling to you, you try to enter here from this location at this time of the day and, I don't know, to do something. In this case, it's hard to be vague because you know all the information, but at the same point, it's also retrieving lots of information. So this information can be accessed from people to be able to see which is your accessing routines and try to perform personalized attacks. And also, if you have access to the device, again, you could forge the whole message. You could say that you were trying to access from this device and in this case, any user would not realize about the difference. So we need to find a better solution that is able to prevent any unwanted action to happen. We don't want anyone to be with control of our computer and willing to do things that we're not allowed to do. But at the same point, we want to keep the privacy of the action. We don't want anyone that has access to the channel to be able to know the routines of our users. Yeah, we also want verification by the user, of course. We want him to be a part of it because it's our most interested client. And it needs to be usable for this reason. So at least it should be as good as a second factor authentication. What we realized here is that the properties are basically a subset of the properties of the electronic voting. So you want privacy, you want correctness, and you want some sort of verification. So can we do the proof of correctness that we were mentioning for cast as intended? Can we do that in a generalized way so that it serves more than one purpose, not only for voting, but only for other cases? Yeah, we come up with the idea of doing something very similar to second factor authentication, but with the operations in a way that it's secure. So our initial idea was, let's assume that we have privacy and correctness as a requirement that we don't care. Those are no longer a requirement. So how do we do this? How do we fix this problem when nothing of it is a problem? You will just send the information of the transaction, and the user will accept the transaction, right? And then the server would proceed with this transaction. This is basically what they were doing wrong with second factor authentication, right? You just give all the information and he agrees on this information. Let's just say that now we want to add privacy because the main problem of this approach was that we were leaking privacy, right? So instead of just sending the message, what we will do is encrypt the content. So the only one who would have access to this information would be someone in your laptop, some attacker with access to your laptop, but at least people just checking the traffic that you are generating will not be allowed to know anything about it. The problem when you do that is that you are introducing keys, at least symmetric keys, because otherwise there is no encryption, and the key is it must be somewhere, right? So I need a second device at least to be able to have this key secured, because if it's in the same device and the first one, I cannot ensure that the attacker doesn't have access. So what happens if the device where I had it, the original device in which I had the key, was corrupted? Then for privacy issues, well, it will know all the information, but if it was your device, it would be the same, right? I mean, he already has the key, so that doesn't change a thing. For integrity, it's completely different because you got the information, but if you got the keys, you might modify it, right? if the device modifies one of the communications, it might be able to cheat on the user. So this basically means that we need an additional device, which will be the one that we use in order to validate the actions from the first device. So let's see an overview of how would we talk about a second factor authentication. Correctness. In this protocol, I will use like generic names, so like entities or users. So it's not related to any specific functionality. We need a user, which is the one which has the corrupted device. And we need an entity, which is going to receive the petitions, the request. Then we are going to assume, in this case, that we have a corrupted device. And we are going to assume that we have a secondary device that we are going to call the validation device. What do we want from this validation device? Well, mainly, we want this validation device to not be accessible by network connection. We want to prevent any attacker to be able to gain access on this device. So if we want it for security reasons, we just need to assume that it's going to be used only for this. For usability reasons, we designed this device to be able to read QR codes. It might know, or at least have a knowledge of some cryptography operations, mostly hash functions and symmetric key cryptography. And it should have at least an output channel, like a screen or some way to provide information to the user in order for the user to validate something. So, given that it has to include symmetric key cryptography, we also need to be able to store the size of a symmetric key. Hopefully, this is not a very big size of key, so most of the devices will be able to accommodate to this restriction. So, how do we interact? Let's say the user has to do a petition. For this case, we might ensure, like, I don't know, let's find something to buy on eBay. So the user wants the corrupted device to send the petition to buy something. Then the eBay servers would store this petition, but instead of serving it, it would put it on hold because the server doesn't know if the user really wanted or it's just a corrupted device trying to cheat. What it should happen is that the server will derive a very short-lived key using the original key that it exchanged with the user and the timestamp. After that, eBay will encrypt all the transaction information using this symmetric key, and it will also generate a validation code, so the user would have the opportunity to interact with the server directly through this validation code. Meanwhile, it will also generate a confirmation code, because imagine that after sending the information, the device just decides to not send the validation code. This would still deny the service for the user, but the user would have no information about it. So for this reason, the server from eBay should be able to retrieve information directly to the device again. Then the last step is, once all this information has been sent, it generates our corrupted device, generates a QR code with this encrypted information and prints it to the user. So then it is the petition validation phase. So we have already sent the petition as a user. Now I need to validate that everything was right. So I would use the second device to scan the QR code. From the QR code, I would obtain the timestamp. From the timestamp and the secret key that it was stored on the device, it would derive the key, the symmetric key used for this encryption. And when it retrieves all the information that was encrypted, it will have the validation code, the confirmation code, and all the information of the transaction. Right? The only thing that it needs to do now, the device, is to show the validation code to the user, so the user can input the validation code to the device. And as I mentioned before, once the validation code is sent, we just need to confirm from the server that the validation code was correct. So it just requires another code that will be sent back to the user. In this way, if we assume that we have an attacker which is able to have control over all the devices involved on this transaction, I mean, the device from which the user wants to do this shop opportunity in eBay, we know for sure that this attacker would not be able to buy anything but the things the user was willing to buy, right? So this is the main target of this second factor correctness. But once we had this idea, we were thinking, who is going to buy? I mean, we need to find someone who is interested in it enough to buy it. Otherwise, it's just a funny exercise, but it doesn't make any sense. So which is a good use case for it? We were thinking, which kind of transactions are so important that people cannot stay without knowing it was correct? And also we need that this transaction is so important also that if the user has some problem or some extra difficulty to realize it, it will not matter as long as he gets confidence. So some operation that the correctness is even more important than the quality of service of the application. And we found that banking, internet banking, it's one of the best solutions. So we want to design something that provides second factor correctness for bank transactions. We first do some research and we check all banks, more or less all of them have some operations for that. Usually they send you an SMS to confirm that you have done something, or even in some cases they might even call you and try to gather information about your last transaction. There are also some security numbers that they are sent in in another way, like from email or any other channel. Basically, these are the ones that we can see. So you have a message in which basically it says, hey, if you want to pay this amount with this credit card from this bank, you should input this code. But again, if I am the attacker and I have access to your mobile phone from which you are buying, what is the difference? For me as an attacker, I have access to everything. I can fake your SMS code. I can input directly the code and show you a different information. For this reason, they also found another tool, which is a second device. They perform the operation and then they ask you to input a code which is on your device. But if I am the attacker and I have changed the petition, and instead of paying, I don't know, 100,000 dirhams to some of your friends, I just decided to send this amount of money to a different bank account. The fact that you put a code that it was for your security and only you were able to know, would it change the attack for me? No, you would already retrieve me the code because you will think that you are doing the proper operation. For this reason, we designed a device which we call SFC device because of the second factor correctness. And this device has a secret seed, has a small display, a QR code reader, has some cryptographic operations. Not the cryptographic operations. Let's say it's able to compute some cryptographic operations. In our case, we chose KDF, AES, and SHA-3. And just for this reason, in our case, the security of all the system will rely on this second device that we have set it up with these constraints. We are going to use this device to prevent attacks. So it will be way more conservative for it to not allow internet connection, as we mentioned before. We don't want someone to gain access to our second device because it's very hard to protect against it. So let's just assume it's a second device. It doesn't need to be connected to internet. Let's reduce the threat vector from an attacker. Also, the capabilities of the device must be very restricted. We only want the device to be able to decrypt, hash, KDF, and print. We don't want the device to do anything else. All the rest of operations might be threat vectors for a possible attacker. And in this case, the main threat vector for us is the communication between the corrupted device and our validation device, which is this SFC device. How is this communication done? Through the QR code. So we need to be very sure that on checking the QR code, we don't get any threat vector that can gain at least some kind of operations on our device. There are also some physical things or some physical approaches to prevent attacks on getting the seed, but all of them would increase the cost. So it is a matter of what our client would need. So if a bank thinks that their clients would pay more for a device like that, they can just protect it. But in theory, the device will be with them. So it's very hard to get, let's say, to get physical access to it from an attacker without the original user getting to know it. So we have 3 phases. We have the QR code generation phase, in which you basically, your device sends the petition, right? Your corrupted device sends the request, and the server replies with a QR code. Okay, so this is it. How do you do that? Well, you just send all the information. You have the KDF of the seed, so the key, and the timestamp of the operation. And you add all the information of the transaction, the amount that you wanted to send, the account that you wanted to be the receiving of the money, even the currency. And from this information, you just put it all together. You compute the SHA-3 hash using your secret seed and some kind of a SALT, which is the validate word or the confirm word. And you generate 2 different codes. Encrypt them using the short-lived key that we generated previously, and put it on a QR code format. As easy as this, you have your own application sending a code which will validate all the operations. Then we have the other side, which is the user with this QR code scanning. It will just check the QR code, it will receive the code that he has to input, and it will just give it to the device. So the device will only know the code, but it won't know if it's something that he can do with, because the code is directly binded to the operation that the user has validated previously. So there is no way for an attacker to compute a different code or to use this code for a different transaction, because this code requires all the information from the original transaction. Right? So let's see how it does. Basically, the device scans the QR code, the device checks the timestamp, validates if the timestamp is close to the time when you are validating the operation. Otherwise, it might be some attacks using timestamps from the past and basically using all the information from a different transaction. Then it derives the same key because it has the seed and the timestamp, and decrypts all the information, computes the hash functions, and obtains the code. The code is obtained through this encode function. Depending on the amount of precision that you want, you can decide different encode functions, like taking the last 4 digits from the SHA. It would be a very poor precision encoding, but you can choose something bigger, something that the user would still remain, but it's easier for the it's harder for the attacker to be able to forge. And yeah, that's what it was. So we have the information, we retrieve the validation code, the user also gets the confirmation code on his SFC device, and then the final step is the confirmation, in which basically the server would receive the validation code, check that the code is correct, and give back a confirmation code to the user, which by this last confirmation code will be ensured that the whole operation has been done properly. In the case in which one of these codes has not been properly retrieved, there is a designed an acknowledged amount of time for the voter to contact the bank or the entity that is in charge of it in order to validate that this operation has been stopped at some point, or that it contains the right information. But in this way, we know for sure that the attacker cannot find any way any way to attack the correctness of the operations. There are other ways of doing it using zero-knowledge proof. Basically, with this approach, you would be able even to show a third party that your client was willing to do something without retrieving any information. But by adding this, we just found out that it would make all the process way slower. It would complicate the operations. It would ask for way more money to have a proper device to be able to deal with all this information. And at the end, the banks don't need anyone else to audit that the operation was correct. So for this reason, we just forgot about zero-knowledge proofs, although it might be cases in which adding them might solve some different issues for correctness in other environments. Important or final remarks. Well, most important thing is this second factor correctness, it's not unbreakable. If someone gets access to your device, gets access to the seed, there are different ways to attack it. But what you know for sure is that the attacker may have his success probabilities drastically reduced because it might need way more capabilities to be able to perform an attack. So, which are these extra capabilities? Well, it might try to do side channel on your device to be able to retrieve the key. Again, it will need physical access to the device. This could be also prevented. For this reason, the most important thing is you need to know the limitations of the solution that you are using. So therefore, you can implement some risk measures. If you know that you are not going to get attacked by side channel or physical attacks, then just assume that this is the right thing, put your risk on your side, or pay more and build a device that is more resistant to these attacks. So which is the future work? We have been talking about theory. We have been talking about we have this device, we use it this way, but now we would like to be able to put it in practice and to see how it works. So the next step is make it real. Build the device and try to sell it. And when we do this, we will find problems with mainly one, which is key rotation. So we have a key on a device, but this key cannot be the same key all the time, because otherwise it might end up leaking information and it will compromise previous operations. For this reason, it is very important to find a proper key rotation mechanism that allows the interaction between the bank and the device to be smooth and properly done. This is very interesting, but if you do it from the QR code, you are adding a threat vector, so an attacker might try to change the key from the user. Everything got way more complicated, and it's also very interesting for future work. And yeah, there are also the topic with the QR codes. It might be that the QR codes are already a little bit old-fashioned. Maybe instead of a device that is able to read a QR code, we might think of I don't know, or a smartwatch that instead of have internet connections validates all your operations. Maybe some kind of I don't know, something like this. The Google glasses that once you do the operation, it retrieves the information. That would be interesting. And this is the ending remark. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be more than happy to answer all the questions that you might have.
Do we have any questions?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Didn't you think of adding biometric, like your fingerprint or facial recognition, as a second factor instead of having a hardware, generating seeds, generating keys, adding more, let's say, hardware stuff on the user side to ensure the second factor correctness?
The problem when you think about using the biometrics is that if you use the biometrics on the same device that you were using to compute all your important transaction, the device will learn the information and will use it even if you don't want. So the device will try to cheat on you, and it will be a social engineering way of approaching your problem. So we found out that for us it was way more convenient to rely on the fact that you don't do anything with your original device, because all the information that you retrieve to the original device either is binded to the transaction or the device would just use it to attack you. So biometrics, it's very interesting because it authenticates you, but it doesn't serve the purpose of the correctness, because you will give it to the device and the device would use it on your behalf. That's the reason why we need to have the second one. But yeah, we also talk about it. It was a good question.
Anybody else? All right. If there are no more questions, then I'd like to thank Victor for that talk. I hope we have more secure applications using this research that you've done. So really, thank you.
Thank you.